The air in the shrine was thick with the scent of old wood, incense, and silent contempt. It clung to the heavy silk of the kimono that swallowed Amira's small frame, the fabric of borrowed armor she didn't know how to wear. She kept her eyes fixed on a single, polished floorboard, counting the grains in the wood as if it were a rosary. Each count was a breath. Each breath was a second she survived. Around her, the men of the Inagawakai watched, their faces carved from stone and disapproval. They were sharks in tailored suits, their power a palpable pressure in the room. This ceremony was not a union, it was a branding, a mark of shame seared onto the skin of their leader. And then there was him, Ryu. He stood beside her, a statue of contained fury. At 35, he commanded a presence that should have filled the sacred space, but today, he seemed diminished, caged by the very traditions he was meant to uphold. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his eyes dark, empty voids that looked at nothing, especially not at her. Amira was his humiliation personified. A 19-year-old black girl from a world so far removed from theirs it might as well have been another planet. She was the weapon his rivals had chosen to break him. Takeda, his uncle and chief adversary, stood in the front row, a ghost of a smile playing on his thin lips. He had orchestrated this. He had found a loophole in the clan's ancient laws, forcing Ryu into a marriage that would strip him of his mystique and paint him as a leader incapable of controlling his own house. Marry, or be seen as rejecting the old ways. And Takeda had chosen the bride with surgical cruelty. The priest's voice droned on, a meaningless river of syllables. Amira felt a tremor run through Ryu's hand as he was forced to take hers. His skin was cold, his grip like steel, devoid of any warmth or humanity. It was a transaction. A transfer of ownership. She was no longer Amira, the art student who loved charcoal sketches and quiet cafes. She was now a symbol of a powerful man's downfall. When the moment came to exchange the sacred sake, her hands shook so badly she nearly spilled the small cup. Ryu's fingers brushed against hers, a spark of ice that made her flinch. His eyes met hers for the first time, and what she saw in them was not just anger, but a profound, bottomless despair. It was the look of a king watching his own execution. The ceremony ended. There was no applause, only the heavy, suffocating silence of judgment. As they walked out of the shrine, Takeda bowed, his voice a silken poison. "Congratulations, nephew. May your union be fruitful," the insult was clear. This marriage was a barren field, a testament to Ryu's impotence in the face of his enemies. Ryu said nothing. He simply walked past, pulling her along, his grip on her arm the only thing keeping her upright. She was his wife. She was his shame. And their life together had just begun in a tomb of silent hatred. The black sedan moved through Tokyo's glittering veins like a phantom. Inside, the silence was a physical entity, a third passenger pressing down on them. Amira stared out the window, watching the neon lights bleed across the rain-slicked glass, the vibrant chaos of the city a stark contrast to the sterile void within the car. She could feel Ryu's presence beside her, a vortex of rage and stillness. He had not spoken a single word to her since leaving the shrine. He had not even looked in her direction. She was a ghost, a piece of luggage he was forced to transport. She pulled the heavy kimono tighter around herself, the unfamiliar fabric feeling more like a shroud with every passing minute. She was so far from home, a pawn in a game whose rules were written in a language of violence and honor she could not comprehend. Fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but beneath it, a strange sort of numbness had set in. It was the mind's last defense against a reality too terrifying to process. They arrived at a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a needle of glass and steel. A private elevator whisked them upwards, the ascent so smooth and silent it felt like a descent into a deeper level of hell. The doors opened directly into a penthouse suite that was more of a palace than an apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the sprawling city, a carpet of infinite lights. The space was immense, decorated in a minimalist style of dark wood, black leather, and brushed chrome. It was beautiful, masculine, and utterly devoid of warmth. A gilded cage. Ryu walked to the center of the room and finally turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, his eyes as cold and distant as the stars outside. "There are rules," he said, his voice a low, gravelly sound that vibrated through the quiet air. It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. "You will not speak to me unless spoken to. You will not leave this apartment without my permission and my security detail. You will not touch my things. You are part of my household now, but you are not my wife. You are a duty, a contract, nothing more." Amira simply nodded, her throat too tight to form words. Her gaze drifted around the sterile, perfect space. There was nothing of her here. There was no room for her. She was an unwelcome stain on his perfect, monochrome world. He watched her, a flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps, crossing his face at her silence. "Do you understand?" he demanded, his tone sharper now. She found her voice a small, fragile thing. Yes, he seemed to want more, some sign of protest or tears, something to fuel his anger. But she gave him nothing, only quiet compliance. He gestured toward a hallway. "Your room is that way. I do not want to see you until morning." He turned his back on her, walking over to the vast window and staring out at the city he ruled, but which now felt like it was closing in on him. Amira retreated down the hallway he had indicated, the borrowed silk of the kimono whispering against the polished floor. The room was just as luxurious and impersonal as the rest of the penthouse, with a bed large enough for 4 people and a bathroom clad in black marble. She closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch sounding like a final, definitive seal on her prison. She was alone, married to a man who hated the very sight of her, trapped in a life that was not her own. The numbness began to recede, and for the first time, a single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek. She spent hours in that room, methodically unpinning her hair and extricating herself from the layers of the suffocating kimono. Underneath, she was just herself again, in a simple cotton slip, but she felt irrevocably changed. The silence from the main living area was absolute. She imagined Ryu standing by that window all this time, a sentinel of his own misery. Hunger gnawed at her, a simple, physical need that felt absurd in the face of her complex dread. She hadn't eaten since the small, tense breakfast that morning. Hesitantly, she opened her door and crept into the hallway. The main room was empty. A glass of amber liquid sat half full on a low table, but Ryu was gone. Another door, further down the hall, was closed. His room. The kitchen was a sleek, metallic marvel, intimidating in its perfection. She found a kettle, tea leaves in a simple tin, and a plain ceramic cup. The simple ritual of making tea was grounding. It was a piece of her old life, a small act of normalcy in a world that had been turned upside down. She was about to carry the cup back to her room when she heard a sound from the living area. A crash. The sharp, violent shatter of glass. Her heart leaped into her throat. She froze, listening. Silence followed, thick and heavy. Against every instinct screaming at her to hide, a different, quieter impulse took over. She walked slowly toward the source of the sound. Ryu was there, standing by the window. The tumbler he had been holding was now 1,000 glittering shards on the dark floor. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. He was a man holding himself together by a thread. He spoke without turning, his voice rough. "I told you to stay in your room." Amira stopped, her hands clutching the warm teacup. "I heard a noise," she whispered. "I was making tea." He finally turned, and his eyes, when they met hers, were blazing with a cold, controlled fire. "This is not a home. You are not a hostess. This is a cage, and we are both trapped in it. Do not forget that." He expected her to retreat, to scurry back to her room like a frightened mouse. But she stood her ground. She looked from his face to the broken glass, then back to him. "It's still your cage," she said, her voice barely audible but clear in the silent room. "You shouldn't break your own things." The statement was so simple, so unexpected, that it seemed to momentarily break through his wall of fury. He stared at her, a flicker of surprise in his dark eyes. He saw the teacup in her hands, the steam rising from it in a fragile wisp. He saw her, not as the symbol of his shame, but as a young woman in a cotton slip, looking small and lost in his vast, empty home. He said nothing. He simply turned back to the window. Amira hesitated for a moment longer, then walked quietly to the low table. She placed the cup of tea down, a silent offering. Then, without another word, she went to the kitchen, found a dustpan and brush, and began to carefully sweep up the shards of broken glass. Ryu watched her reflection in the dark window, a strange, unreadable expression on his face. She wasn't fighting him. She wasn't crying. She was cleaning up his mess. In that moment, a silent, fragile truce was formed. They were not husband and wife. They were prisoners, and they would survive this together. The days that followed were a study in silent coexistence. Amira learned the rhythms of the penthouse, the quiet hum of the climate control, the precise times Ryu's men would deliver food and supplies, leaving them outside the door like offerings to a caged beast. She learned the sound of Ryu's footsteps, the way he moved through the space with a predator's contained grace. They rarely spoke. Their communication was one of absence and observation. She discovered he had a library, a room filled with books on history, philosophy, and military strategy, all in Japanese. She would sometimes find a book left open, a passage underlined, offering a fleeting glimpse into the mind of the man who was her husband in name only. In turn, she had found a small sketchbook and a single pencil left in a drawer in her room. It became her sanctuary. She drew the city from the window, the endless sprawl of lights, the distant mountains shrouded in mist. She drew the furniture in the room, the sharp angles and cold surfaces. She drew everything except him. He was a void she could not bring herself to capture on paper. Their first test came a week after the wedding. A formal dinner with the clan's top lieutenants. Amira was instructed to wear a simple, dark dress and to remain silent. She was to be a shadow at his side, a beautiful but empty vessel. The dinner was held in a private room of an exclusive restaurant, the air thick with cigar smoke and the low rumble of powerful men's voices. Takeda was there, his eyes glittering with malice as they fell upon Amira. The meal was an excruciating exercise in passive aggression. The men spoke only in Japanese, their words flying too fast for her to grasp, but their tone was unmistakable. It was one of mockery. They would look at her, then back at Ryu, a cruel smirk on their faces. Takeda finally switched to English, his voice smooth and condescending, clearly for her benefit. Your new bride is very quiet, Ryu. Does she have a voice? Or did you choose one who would not talk back? Ryu's hand tightened on his chopsticks, the only sign of the fury simmering beneath his placid exterior. She has a voice for when it matters, he said, his tone dangerously soft. She does not waste it on fools. The insult hung in the air, a blade drawn. Takeda laughed, a dry, rasping sound. Brave words. But a leader's strength is judged by his house. And your house, it looks very different now, he gestured vaguely at Amira. Exotic. But not of our world. A distraction. A weakness, the other men murmured in agreement, their loyalty shifting like sand. Amira could feel their collective judgment pressing down on her, an immense weight. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. But then she looked at Ryu. She saw the muscle twitching in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip he had on the table's edge. She saw the profound isolation in his eyes as he sat surrounded by his own men, his own family, who were circling him like wolves. In that moment, her fear was eclipsed by a different emotion. A flicker of empathy. A strange, unwelcome sense of alliance with this cold, distant man who was her jailer. He was as trapped as she was. Their silent routine continued, but something had subtly shifted after that disastrous dinner. A new tension filled the penthouse, the feeling of a storm gathering on the horizon. Ryu spent more time in his library, the door closed for hours on end. Amira could hear his voice, low and sharp, speaking on the phone. She didn't need to understand the words to know they were the sounds of a man fighting a war on all fronts. One evening, She found him asleep in one of the leather armchairs in the living room, a book fallen open on his chest. In sleep, the hard lines of his face softened. The mask of the unyielding Yakuza boss was gone, and for the first time, she saw the weary man beneath. He looked younger, more vulnerable. An almost overwhelming urge to reach out, to smooth the furrow in his brow, washed over her. She resisted, but the feeling lingered. It scared her. The next morning, she woke to find a large, flat package outside her bedroom door. There was no note. Inside, she found a complete set of professional-grade artist's charcoal, sketching pencils of every weight, and several large pads of high-quality textured paper. She stared at them, her heart pounding. How did he know? She had never spoken of her art, her passion, the life she had been forced to leave behind. He must have seen her crude sketches in the small notebook. He had been observing her, just as she had been observing him. It was not a gift of affection. It was a gesture of acknowledgement, a recognition that she was a person with a history, a soul, not just a prop in his tragic play. That afternoon, she brewed a pot of his favorite dark roast coffee, a brand she had noted from the deliveries, and left a cup on the small table beside his library door. She didn't knock. She just left it there. When she passed by an hour later, the cup was gone. This became their new language, a silent exchange of small kindnesses. A charcoal sketch of the morning skyline left on the dining table. A plate of perfectly cut fruit left for her in the kitchen. They were two solitary lighthouses, signaling to each other across a vast, dark ocean of loneliness and danger, acknowledging that the other was still there, still breathing. The bars of their cage were still cold and hard, but for the first time, it felt a little less empty. The breaking point arrived with the suddenness of a lightning strike. A summons came for an emergency meeting of the clan elders. Ryu dressed that morning with a grim, final sort of precision, his movements sharp and deliberate. He chose a dark suit, a crisp white shirt, and a black tie. It looked like armor for a battle he knew he was going to lose. He paused at the door before leaving, and for the first time, his eyes met hers with a flicker of something other than anger or indifference. It might have been a warning, or a farewell. Stay inside. Do not open the door for anyone, he commanded, his voice tight. Then he was gone. Amira spent the day in a state of high anxiety. The silence of the penthouse was no longer peaceful, it was menacing. She tried to draw, but her hands were unsteady. Every line she made seemed jagged and fearful. She watched the sun set over the city, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. The sound of the elevator door opening made her jump. It was almost 3 a.m. Ryu stumbled into the room, his tie loosened, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder. His face was a pale, haggard mask, and he moved like a man who had been physically beaten, though there were no visible marks on him. He walked directly to the bar, pouring a glass of whiskey with a trembling hand and downing it in one go. He poured another. He didn't seem to notice she was there, curled up in a chair in the corner of the dark room. They sided with him, he said, his voice a raw, broken whisper. He was talking to himself, to the ghosts in the room. All of them. My own lieutenants. The men my father trusted. They stood there and watched as Takeda stripped me of my authority. They called me weak, unfit. He slammed the empty glass down on the counter, the sound cracking the silence. They said my marriage was the final proof that I had brought a stain into the clan, an outsider, a contamination. Each word was a blow, and Amira felt the phantom impact of it. This was her fault. Her existence was the knife they had used to gut him. He paced the room, his movements agitated, a caged tiger lashing against invisible bars. He stopped in front of the vast window, his back to her, his shoulders slumped in defeat. The city lights reflected on the glass, surrounding him, but he looked utterly alone, a king dethroned and exiled in his own castle. His entire body began to shake, a tremor that started in his hands and radiated through him. He braced himself against the window, his head bowed, and a sound tore from his throat, a choked, ragged sob of pure agony. It was the sound of a man who had held everything inside for a lifetime, a dam of pride and control finally breaking under unbearable pressure. He wept, not loudly, but with a deep, shuddering violence that seemed to shake the very foundations of his soul. The untouchable, invincible Yakuza boss was gone. In his place was just a man, broken and betrayed by everyone he had ever trusted. Amira's heart broke with him. All the fear, all the resentment she had felt toward him dissolved in that moment, washed away by the raw, unfiltered pain she was witnessing. He was not her jailer. He was her fellow prisoner. Slowly, silently, she rose from her chair. She crossed the cavernous room, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floor. He didn't hear her approach. He was lost in his own private hell. She stopped just behind him, her own hands trembling. She didn't know what to do, what to say. There were no words for this kind of grief. So she did the only thing she could. She reached out and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind, pressing her cheek against the hard muscle of his back. He flinched violently, his whole body going rigid, a cornered animal preparing to strike. "Don't," he rasped, his voice thick with tears. But she didn't let go. She held on, her grip gentle but firm. She said nothing, offering only the silent, solid weight of her presence. For a long moment, he remained stiff, fighting it. Then, with a shuddering exhale, the fight went out of him. He sagged against her, his body heavy with exhaustion and despair. His hands came up and covered hers, his fingers gripping her with a desperate strength. He leaned into her embrace, and the silent, violent sobs gave way to quiet, exhausted tears that soaked the shoulder of his expensive shirt. In the reflection of the glass, amidst the glittering lights of a merciless city, they were just two people, holding on to each other in the dark. The first light of dawn crept into the penthouse, casting long, gray shadows across the room. They had stood like that for what felt like hours, Amira holding him, Ryu leaning on her until his tears subsided into exhausted silence. He had not pulled away. He had not spoken. He had simply allowed himself to be held, a surrender more profound than any defeat he had suffered in the clan meeting. When he finally stirred, it was a slow, weary movement. He gently disentangled himself from her embrace and turned to face her. His eyes were red-rimmed and shadowed with exhaustion, but the raw agony was gone, replaced by a quiet, hollowed-out calm. For the first time, his gaze held no anger, no contempt, only a deep, bone-weary vulnerability. "Thank you," he whispered, the words so soft she barely heard them. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and in his eyes, she was no longer a symbol of his humiliation, but the one person who had seen him break and had not turned away. Something fundamental had shifted between them in the darkness. The unspoken truce had become an unspoken alliance. That morning, Ryu did not retreat into his library. He made coffee, his movements methodical and sure, and brought 2 cups to the small table where she sat sketching. He sat down opposite her, a silent companion in the morning light. The war was not over. In fact, it had just entered its most dangerous phase. But he was no longer fighting it alone. "Takeda thinks he has won," Ryu said, breaking the comfortable silence. His voice was different now. The broken edge was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. "He thinks because I showed emotion, because I value things beyond pure, brutal power, that I am weak. He is a fool. He has mistaken honor for a flaw." He looked at Amira, a strange intensity in his gaze. "He used you as a weapon against me. He underestimated me. But more than that, he underestimated you." It was the first time he had ever acknowledged her as anything more than a circumstance. He saw her now. A new strategy began to form, not in the loud, aggressive confrontations Takeda favored, but in the quiet of the penthouse. Ryu began to fight back, but not with fists or threats. He used his mind. He pulled out old ledgers, financial records, and clan documents he had kept hidden for years. He worked relentlessly, piecing together a puzzle of Takeda's corruption, his illegal side dealings, and the money he had been siphoning from the clan for decades. And in this new war, Amira became his unlikely second-in-command. She could not read the Japanese characters in the ledgers, but she had an artist's eye for patterns. She sat with him, pointing out inconsistencies in the numbers, noticing flows of money that seemed out of place, her outsider's perspective cutting through the complex web of Yakuza business. She organized his notes, created charts, and brought him food and coffee when he forgot to eat. She was his anchor, her quiet, steady presence a balm to his frayed nerves. He began to talk to her, not just about the clan, but about his father, about the weight of the legacy he carried, about the loneliness of being at the top. And she listened. She didn't offer advice, but her listening was an act of profound support. He had spent his life surrounded by men who feared him. He had never had someone who simply saw him. The penthouse, once a prison, had transformed into a war room, a sanctuary, and, unexpectedly, a home. The final confrontation was not set in a smoky backroom or at the point of a sword. Ryu called a formal council of the 5 families, the oldest and most respected leaders of the Yakuza alliance. He requested the meeting be held in a neutral space, a modern conference room in a corporate tower, stripping the proceedings of the usual intimidation and ceremony. Takeda arrived smug and confident, flanked by his new followers, assuming this was Ryu's final, pathetic plea. He was wrong. Ryu stood before the elders, calm and composed. He did not raise his voice. He did not issue threats. He simply presented the evidence. He laid out the ledgers, the bank statements, the irrefutable proof of Takeda's years of theft and betrayal, all meticulously organized. He used a projector, displaying the flow of money for all to see, a cold, corporate presentation of a deeply personal treason. He spoke of honor, not as a tool of violence, but as a foundation of trust. Takeda told you I was weak because my house was not in order, Ryu said, his voice resonating with quiet authority. He was right. My house was not in order, because there was a viper in it. A man who mistakes tradition for a shield to hide his own greed. The elders were silent, their faces grim as the evidence mounted. Takeda's blustering denials grew weaker and weaker until he was left sputtering in impotent rage. The power in the room shifted, a palpable tide turning against him. His followers began to distance themselves, their faces masks of shock and dawning fear. Ryu had not won by being more brutal, he had won by being smarter, more patient. He had honored the clan's true principles by exposing the man who had corrupted them. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then the oldest of the leaders, a man whose face was a roadmap of 100 battles, stood up. He looked at Takeda with utter contempt. You have dishonored us all. The verdict was absolute. Takeda was stripped of his rank, his assets seized, and he was exiled, a fate worse than death for a man whose entire identity was tied to the clan. He was dragged from the room, a pathetic, defeated old man. Ryu stood alone in the center of the room, the victor. He had not just reclaimed his position, he had redefined it. He had shown them that strength was not just savagery, but integrity and intelligence. One of the elders approached him. Your position as leader of the Inagawa Kai is secure, Ryu-sama. And your household is your own affair. It will be respected. The apology was unspoken but understood. Ryu simply bowed his head in acknowledgement. When he returned to the penthouse late that night, Amira was waiting for him, a pot of fresh tea on the table. He walked in, not as a defeated man, but as the leader he was always meant to be. He looked at her and a slow smile touched his lips for the first time. It is done, he said. The war was over. And in the quiet of their sanctuary, a new, more peaceful chapter was about to begin. The cage was finally open, but neither of them seemed to be in any hurry to leave. Weeks melted into a quiet rhythm. The penthouse, once a symbol of their shared imprisonment, now felt like a secluded haven, a fortress against the world outside. The constant threat that had hung over them was gone, replaced by a peaceful, almost domestic stillness. Ryu's authority within the clan was absolute now, built on a new foundation of respect rather than fear. He attended his meetings, managed his empire, but he always came home. He came back to her. Their silent language had blossomed into easy conversation. He would tell her about his day, the intricate politics and power plays, simplifying the complex world of the Yakuza for her. He valued her perspective, her outsider's clarity that often cut to the heart of a problem he was too close to see. She, in turn, started talking about her life before this, about her family, her dream of studying art in Paris, the smell of her mother's kitchen. She showed him her drawings, which now included sketches of him, Ryu reading in his library, Ryu staring out at the city, Ryu smiling that rare, small smile that was reserved only for her. One evening, they were sitting on the deep sofa, the city lights twinkling below them. Amira was sketching in her pad, the charcoal whispering across the paper. Ryu was watching her, an uncharacteristically soft expression on his face. The shy, terrified girl he had been forced to marry had become this calm, resilient woman whose quiet strength had been the anchor in his storm. She was beautiful, not just in the elegant lines of her face or the warmth of her brown eyes, but in the gentle confidence she now possessed. He had been so focused on his own humiliation at their wedding that he had failed to see hers. He had been so consumed by his own pain that he had failed to see the grace with which she endured hers. "I am sorry," he said suddenly, his voice low. Amira looked up from her sketchbook, surprised. "For what?" "For all of it," he said, his gaze unwavering. "For what my world did to you. For what I did to you. Forcing you into this cage. I saw you only as a part of my problem. I did not see you at all." Amira put her sketchbook down, her heart aching with a sweet, unfamiliar emotion. "You saw me when it mattered," she replied softly. "And this place, it doesn't feel like a cage anymore." She looked around the vast, beautiful room. "It feels like home." He reached out, his hand covering hers where it rested on the sofa. His touch was no longer the cold, steel grip of their wedding day. It was warm, hesitant, and incredibly gentle. It was a question. She turned her hand over, her slender fingers lacing with his. It was an answer. A current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had survived, of the deep, unbreakable bond that had been forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, a king in a kingdom of shadows. She was the quiet artist who had seen the broken man behind the crown and had not been afraid. He leaned in, his eyes searching hers, and slowly, gently, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, but of reverence. It was a promise, a beginning. In the heart of a glittering, dangerous city, the Yakuza boss and his shy bride had found not a marriage of convenience or a strategic alliance, but a love that was as unexpected and as powerful as a quiet dawn breaking after the longest night.